Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. We have reached, in our series on the history of revolutionary ideas, the two defining revolutions of the modern age, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And we are going to spend a bit of time trying to make sense of some of the ideas that produced them and some of the ideas that were produced by them. Starting with the American Revolution, our guide is going to be the historian Eric Nelson. And today's episode is trying to make sense of how to read the Declaration of Independence. The revolution that we're talking about today, the American Revolution, of the ones that we've discussed in this series, Eric, not just with you, but with others, is probably the one that's still most live in contemporary politics, in the sense that arguments about interpretations of the American Revolution are still the lifeblood of American politics, and quite a lot hangs on them. And we may come back to this right at the end. But there's another set of questions around the interpretation of the revolution, which are also very political. They, I guess, primarily preoccupy historians, but I think they leak out from historical arguments into political arguments, which is, this has been rumbling on for 100 years or more, a question about whether this revolution, which has traditionally been understood as a revolution driven by the world of ideas, that takes place in the world of ideas, the revolutionaries were inspired by a set of texts, a set of principles, and they built a republic on the back of that. The original revision of that said, no, these were men, all of them, white men, all of them, defending their interests. This is a property-based revolution. This is a revolution that needs to be understood in the world of material interests and defense of property. So the first question I want to ask you is just in very general terms about the role of ideas in the American Revolution. How would you characterize the part that ideas played? Are ideas central to this story?
Yeah, it remains, as you say, one of the central questions. And of course, it raises a far broader set of issues. In other words, what you think about this particular case, that's the American Revolution, is probably going to be a function of what you more broadly think about how ideas do or don't play a causal role in historical change. And there have been very smart people on on every conceivable side of this question. And so you have people all the way on one side who take the view that ideas are, to use the annoying philosopher's term, epiphenomenal, meaning they're inefficacious. They produce nothing. They cause nothing. It's kind of background noise or window dressing. Those are all terms that you see used in the sort of writings of people who take this view. And that essentially what motivates people is their interests. And their interests are sort of things that they have separate and apart from the ideas and arguments they use to justify and legitimate their behavior. And so, really, if you want to understand what they're doing, you look at their interests, not what they're saying, because it's not because they believe what they're saying that they're doing what they're doing, broadly speaking. And I don't hold that view. So I think that in general, ideas do play a very serious and important causal role in historical change, particularly revolutionary change of this kind. That is, they play a major role in explaining why political crises happen in the way that they do. And I think the American Revolution is a very important instance of this. But as you say, this debate has been going on for a very long time in this form, really, since the progressive era, when you had historians really beginning to make the case, as you say, that this is really just a kind of economic shift that's taken place in the late 18th century, and that the people who make the revolution are just pursuing their economic interests. They just want to get out of the framework of the Navigation Acts and the British monopoly and various prohibitions on trade, and the rest is history, as they say. But I think it's fair to say that that position remains a minority position among historians, not least because it just seems to make nonsense of the thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of intensely felt, complex argument that these people are engaging in, let alone the letters they're writing to each other and what they're writing in the margins of their own books and everything else, which is all much more consistent with the view that they take very seriously what it is they're arguing about. And there are also reasons for doubting, just on the face of it, whether this economic explanation makes much sense. Because, for instance, the Patriots, as they would then be called by the time we get to 76, are in fact arguing that they're happy to keep the Navigation Acts. That's to say, they just want the Navigation Acts to be kept on a different juridical and theoretical basis. They want to explain why the Navigation Acts apply to them differently, but they have no complaint about their continuing to apply. And what they're objecting to in some of the offending parliamentary statutes are comparatively trivial in their economic significance relative to that. And so, if you assume that what these people are really after is their payday, then their behavior is odd in all kinds of ways.
And we're going to be focusing on two documents, not controversially, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but these are, as products of the revolution, these are written texts. And of course, you could say even written texts don't really matter. Though I think in the case of the Constitution, that would be quite a stretch to say that the constitutional founding document of the Republic doesn't matter. But to your point, in the build up to the production of those documents, those founding documents of the Republic, there was a quite astonishing amount of prior argument in all sorts of other kinds of documents appearing in all sorts of other kinds of forms. So not formal, informal, and pamphlets and leaflets and all of that in an age of newspapers and the rest. But people were writing about the ideas that fed into those formalized ideas. And it is quite hard to see, in a way, why they were bothering. But also, when you tell the story, it does sort of track shifts in the arguments among the people who were operating in the realm of ideas, do seem to cash out in the realm of political action in a way that it's quite hard to explain it simply the other way round, that things happen in the realm of political action and they cash out in the world of ideas. It does, at least, you're the expert on this and I'm not, but in this particular case, it does look like it's hard to do it back to front if that's going to be your way of explaining this. The ideas do seem like drivers of outcomes that matter.
I think that's absolutely right. I also think that it's not an either or. That's to say, it would be silly to argue that the force of events doesn't itself inflect the way that people are thinking about things, just as the way that they're thinking about things will inflect and influence events. I think both things are happening. And I think that's the nature of political crises, that when a crisis happens, like the one that gripped the Atlantic Empire in the 1760s, they put pressure on the ideas that people have, which they might up until that moment have held in a somewhat loose and rough kind of way. It sort of pushes on them and forces people to actually get into the deep tissue of what their arguments imply and what their premises really are and how this all works. There are moments when you can no longer take things for granted. And I think that itself changes how people think. They might come to realize that views that they sort of thought they held and were perfectly fine to hold when the world wasn't in a crisis of this kind suddenly become untenable in various ways, and they're forced to think differently. So I think it's always both. I think there's an enormous loss in historical explanations that don't take both seriously.
Perhaps we should say something about the crisis of the 1760s before we get on to the 1770s and indeed 1776. Where and what do you think first put real pressure on the conventional, maybe unreflective ways in which people thought they understood their own position within this polity in which they existed, which was subject to the British Crown?
Actually, there are multiple things that are going on that are destabilizing the established set of arrangements in British North America at this time. But the sort of general story is the general story for a reason. There's a lot of truth to it. And essentially, where we are is at the end of what in America was called the French and Indian War, what everyone else in the solar system calls the 7 Years' War, the first truly world war, we might say. And when it ends in 1763, it's ended in an enormous British victory over the French. And it is greeted with, sort of euphoria in the British North American colonies initially. This is probably the high watermark of British patriotic feeling in the colonies, the sort of flush of this triumph. But immediately the bills are due. And the question is, how is all this going to be paid for? And Parliament very quickly decides that because, on their view, this war was fought in part, at least the North American part of it, in defense of the colonies, that they should be footing a portion of the bill. And initially, they do this by passing legislation that would take established duties that were already sort of on the books, but not really enforced, duties on trade, and enforce them in a more robust way to raise revenue. And then the sort of watershed moment, which comes in 1765, is the Stamp Act, which is momentous because it's the first instance in which Parliament actually attempted to impose a direct tax on the colonies, not a duty on commercial goods or regulation on trade or whatever, but a direct tax, in this case, effectively a tax on paper and paper products. And that then causes the eruption. And there is this instinctive feeling that something is very wrong about this. But then, of course, the question was, what exactly is wrong about this? And you can see that this is a moment very much, along the lines of what I was trying to get at before, where people are sort of fumbling in the dark a little bit, trying to get their views and the political crisis at hand to sort of map onto each other. So there are a number of false starts in the response of the opposition, let's call it at this point, to the Stamp Act in America. Some people just argue that, yes, Parliament, of course, is the supreme legislature of the British Empire, and it has the right to pass laws in relation to us, to legislate for us. But taxing is not ordinary legislation. Taxing is a very specific kind of thing. In the English constitutional tradition, the House of Commons, when it taxes imposed, what it's doing technically is granting the money of the Commons to the Crown. So it's a kind of gift or grant that requires a particular kind of consent. That was one argument that people made. So legislation, yes, taxing, no. That didn't seem to work particularly well for reasons you can probably intuit. And so almost immediately people were arguing more broadly that yes, Parliament is the supreme legislature of the British Empire, but it shouldn't be making laws for our internal matters. It should only be governing our external affairs, imperial foreign policy, as we might say, and trade. But in terms of what's going on in our local politics, including things like taxing, that's to be done by colonial assemblies and so on. And you begin to get increasingly complex and sophisticated attempts to cut this deck. How do you do this? Eventually you're going to get the argument, well, yes, Parliament has the right to regulate our trade and it can impose duties for that purpose, but not duties that are aimed at the purpose of raising a revenue, because that's just a tax by another, and so on. So they're trying out all of these arguments to try to make sense of their intuition that this is just unjust, this kind of legislature across the ocean in a place most of them have never been to, that is determining what portion of their property they get to keep. And so that's what really gets things going.
And what's interesting about getting from 1765 to 1776 is everything that you have just said is an argument about the role of Parliament. It is the legislature that is the problem. And the central question is, what is our relationship to the legislature? The Declaration of Independence quite explicitly describes the problem as the king. And so one of the puzzles is, how do we get from A to B? And this happens in the world of ideas. I think it's fair to say it happens in the world of ideas. And it's quite a shift. Quite a lot has to happen. Again, it's a big story. But where and how would you characterize the beginnings of that shift, or at least arguments that start to distinguish between the role of Parliament and the role of the King? Because my understanding that you've written about this is, at least for quite a lot of these people, if you're looking for someone or something to protect you against Parliament, actually the most plausible candidate is the King, who is going to be the ultimate object of pure fury. How does that work? How, in this period, are we seeing these people trying to work out how their relationship to the king might actually be a way of protecting themselves from this aggrandizing parliament?
Yeah, it becomes, I think, the central issue. I mean, as you say, what's really striking about the American Revolution when you compare it to the other famous revolutions of the late early modern and modern period, where we talk about the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, it's a revolution that was fundamentally against a legislature, not a king. And as you say, the question, I mean, the crisis is provoked by a claim that Parliament is making, the House of Commons is making, to jurisdiction in America of a particular kind. And really, this just picks up right from where I left off, because as these arguments are going on and the opposition is trying to figure out what it should be saying about this attempt to impose direct taxes and what's wrong with it, eventually the view they reach as the way of cashing out their intuition is from the point of view of constitutional thought in the 18th century British Atlantic world, really radical. Because essentially what they end up arguing, and this begins really already in the first glimmerings you get in the sort of year after the Stamp Act, but really we're talking about 1768, 9, and then into the very early 1770s, you get people beginning to argue that actually Parliament has no jurisdiction whatsoever over America, none. And that the American colonies are, as they said, distinct states within the empire. Okay, but once you've said that, you seem to have a problem, which is how can you have an empire if there's no central coordinating, or as they called it, a harmonizing authority in all of the matters that require one, not just foreign policy, but crucially trade, right? Because these people still held some version of a mercantilist understanding of trade, where there needs to be a balance of a particular kind, and this needs to be regulated from the center, how much specie is leaving the different dominions and how the overall system of trade is balancing out. And so who's going to do this? And the answer they end up with is the king. Their connection to Britain is solely through the person of the king. And the king should be the harmonizing power, using his prerogative to govern imperial foreign policy and trade, and to harmonize the behavior of the different dominion legislatures, of which there were tons, remember, because it's not just the colonies of British America, it's also the Caribbean colonies, it's also Britain itself, Hanover, which is controlled by the British Crown. So, all of this, how do we keep everybody on side? Well, it has to be the king's negative, as they called it. That's to say, the veto. The king has to use his veto to strike down bills in all of the Dominion legislatures, or in any of them, that frustrate or threaten the overall coherence of the imperial design and project, or infringe on the rights of any of the other dominions. Well, that view, once patriots began to defend it, absolutely shocked those who were defending the ministry's policies in America, who will eventually become known as loyalists, but we don't want to call them that yet, and the British public and the British pamphleteers, intellectuals, politicians who are engaging in this debate, because it seemed to take no notice of the fact that the English and the British more broadly had fought two revolutions of their own in the 17th century to subject the king to parliament, to deny that there really was or ought to be in a free country the king outside of parliament, using these prerogative powers on his own to check the legislature, right? That was the view that Charles I and company had been defending, and they'd lost. And so in the 18th century context, what has evolved by now, but when we're talking about the 1760s and 70s, is something along the way to what is recognizably the British Constitution of the modern period, which is to say that there is still something called the Crown, and the Crown still, as a matter of law, has prerogatives, but they are not wielded by the person of the monarch. They're wielded by ministers in the form of a cabinet, and these ministers have to command majority support in the House of Commons and eventually always, and at this period almost always, sit in one of the two houses. And so, first of all, you have that. The prerogatives of the crown are wielded by a ministry acting in furtherance of the agenda of a parliamentary majority, but also a number of these prerogatives hadn't been used for generations. And the central one here was the veto. The negative, as it was called, hadn't been used by a British monarch over a parliamentary bill since the reign of Queen Anne. 1707-8 was the last one, and even that was a weird case for all kinds of reasons. And very interestingly, lots of people on both sides of the Atlantic and almost everyone in America didn't even know that the veto had been used in that case. So they thought, wrongly but comprehensively, that no English monarch had vetoed a bill since the Glorious Revolution. So they associated the use of the veto with the pre Glorious Revolution Constitution. And yet the American opposition was proposing to revive all of this, right? To sort of create a king emperor separate from parliament, separate from the ministry, acting as the kind of hub of the wheel with each spoke radiating outward. So he'd be king of New York in the same way that he was king of Great Britain and king of Hanover, and he'd be king of Virginia and king of Rhode Island. But none of these independent dominions would have any jurisdiction over any of the others. And the coordinating power would be the monarch. And so, to English ears, particularly the vast majority who opposed the opposition cause, and to American ears, the ears of those who didn't join the opposition movement, this sounded just straightforwardly like a repudiation of the entire Whig political and intellectual inheritance, the entire constitutional tradition that had emerged in the previous century plus.
And were they comfortable with that? I mean, if you find yourself, as you search around for a way to justify the position that you feel you've been sort of boxed into, defending 17th century royalist understandings of the Constitution, and therefore, in a way, defending arguments that were used to defend Charles I, Charles II, James II, for goodness sake, before the Glorious Revolution. How did they square that circle? Or at that point, was it not yet because they hadn't conceived of themselves at this point as revolutionaries? That's a later term. They're going to become, in their own minds, what they're going to call patriots. But how much of a challenge was it to find yourself sort of squeezed into a place where you're defending a position which is a position that's at least recognizably the one that was used pre 1688 to defend the prerogatives of a king who ended up having to be kicked out of the country?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And it's, to me, the most fascinating moment in all of this kind of couple of years where they're doing this intellectual work. Because initially, the people who are really introducing the Stuart precedents into the debate are the defenders of the ministry and Lord North and his policies in America. That is, those who are writing to defend these acts of parliamentary legislation over America that are being complained about. And they're writing and saying, wait, hang on, you people, you're supposed to be Whigs, and particularly the New Englanders, you're supposed to be Puritan Whigs. And do you realize that these arguments were made before? They were made by the Stuart monarchs, by James and Charles I in particular. And these pamphleteers have available to them the sort of minutes of the Stuart parliaments of the 1620s, particularly the 1621 parliament, one of the final ones of James I, and then all the way to the first parliaments of Charles I, where these issues are being debated because various bills are proposed, really championed at this point by the Virginia Company and their allies in the House of Commons, to legislate in various ways in relation to American trade, particularly tobacco and fishing, which were the enormous industries, or at least two of them. And at this point, what becomes a famous incident, although I don't think it was remotely known until this moment when people sort of found it in the records, was that the Secretary of State, George Calvert, who eventually becomes Lord Baltimore, walks into the Commons representing the king and says, "This debate has to stop. You have no jurisdiction here." He says to Parliament, in 21, you have no jurisdiction here. The overseas dominions are just that. They're dominions of the crown. Parliament has no jurisdiction in relation to them, and they'll be governed by the royal prerogative. And the people on the other side are the Whig heroes, right, who are saying, of course, Parliament has the right to legislate for America, and so on. And of course, when the guys on the other side introduce these materials, the point is to embarrass the American opposition writers and to sort of prompt them to say, "Wait, hang on, we've wandered off the reservation."
And presumably to say to them, we've seen this story once before, and that position lost. It was defeated.
Yeah. And in fact, to connect this moment, spuriously, by the way, but to connect this moment to the broader constitutional debates and the crisis of the 1640s, because what these British pamphleteers are saying is, look, it wasn't an accident that James and Charles were attempting to assert prerogative control over the American colonies and deny Parliament's jurisdiction, because that would have allowed them to raise a revenue in America so that they wouldn't depend on the House of Commons for raising a revenue, and that would then allow them to tyrannize at home. Nonsense. It's totally wrong. It's fantasy. But that was an argument that they were making. And so, as you say, it's just to sort of embarrass the other side and hope that it prompts a rethink. But in fact, what happens is exactly the reverse, that these opposition writers are sort of reading all of this and they're thinking, well, but they were quite right. Well, that surely was the right position. And after all, these monarchs, James and Charles, were the chartering monarchs. They were the monarchs who had created many of these colonies. And their argument, that is the sort of opposition argument, becomes their constitutional position, whatever else one might want to say about them, their constitutional position on this was absolutely correct. The Whig one was wrong. And in fact, look what happened. Look, the first time that Parliament attempts to legislate for America, not tax, because that doesn't happen until, as I say, the Stamp Act, but the first attempt to legislate for America comes in 1650-51 when the Rump Parliament passes the first Navigation Act. And they're saying, well, look, that's no accident. They just murdered their king in January 1649, and the Rump Parliament usurped his prerogatives and then claimed the right to legislate for America. But that was illegal. It was always been illegal. And it's sort of the original sin that has to be undone. Not because, as I said at the beginning, not because they weren't willing to abide by the Navigation Act, but they just wanted it to be understood, as they said, as a concession. That's to say, not because Parliament has juridical authority over America, but just we'll play along with that. We'll agree.
And these arguments then turn into arguments which maybe we're more familiar with about representation. That is, what is the claim of the Parliament, the British Parliament, to represent the colonies? The colonies, as you say, have their own parliaments, their own legislatures, and these have been things that are built up after the original chartering. So I have two questions here. So one is about the charters and one is about the idea of representation. As you talk about this, thinking about material interests, my feeling is that they alight on the idea that it's the royal prerogative and not the parliamentary prerogative that will decide on matters of trade. But behind that is a view that actually the king is much, much less likely to do it, in a sense, that what you have when Parliament starts getting involved in these things, and then you move from regulating trade to tax and so on, is you have a body that is almost inherently bound to, because of its own material interests and because of the people who sit in it, to start expanding the scope of its jurisdiction. Whereas you can be more confident and more comfortable with the idea if it's a direct personal relationship with the king and to the king's council or whatever it would have been, rather than ministers sitting in parliament, that they're sort of not going to do it, if you know what I mean. That somehow what you have here is you're alighting on that 17th century version of constitutional politics because there is an instinctive sense that it is safer. It is less likely to sort of leak out. What you have with Parliament is a body that, because of the powers it's acquired during the 18th century, has become a kind of monster which doesn't know its own limits. The king is inherently limited. It's just a person, it's just a man, or occasionally a woman, with a limited array of people around this person. They're not going to be able in the way that they weren't actually able in the 17th century. Once these colonies were chartered, they were pretty much able to do their own thing. It's Parliament that is this sort of monster of expansion, expansive power, and the king is the bulwark against that. Is that fair? And then how does that then relate to the question of who is actually representing you when you're an ocean away? And I feel these two things are connected.
I think there are actually several issues in there. So the first one is, why might the opposition in America have been less worried about entrusting a great deal of power over them to the crown rather than to Parliament? And part of that, I mean, there is this moment where they're rediscovering all of these arguments that the Stuarts are making and that royalists had been making for a very long time. And one of the most established ones, which you find these pamphleteers making constantly by the time you get into the 1770s, is that the king is a sort of more reliable protector of the liberties of subjects because his interests are bound up in a particularly stable way with the interests of the whole realm over time. This is something that Charles I, or the people writing for him, argues in his answer to the 19 Propositions, back in 1642, that it's actually the king who's the better guardian of liberty because it's in his interest to see the realm as a whole prosper, and it's his ultimate goal to pass on a prosperous realm to his heir. And so not only is he interested in the whole rather than the part, but he also has what we would call now a kind of long time horizon, right? He'll resist short-term political gains that have long-term costs of serious dimensions. But parliamentary majorities are factional. And they're not like this in all kinds of ways. And so they will prefer the short term to the long term, the interest of the part over the whole, and you get tyrannical behavior. And so one of the things that happens is they're just taking that argument and applying it to the imperial context. As I say, it becomes a very common thing to say. But they also, as you're suggesting, are having to confront this argument that the defenders of the ministry are making, which is the Americans have no grounds to complain when they say no taxation without representation, famously, because they are represented. They're represented in Parliament. They're represented in Parliament in exactly the same way that British subjects are represented in Parliament. And they're using this theory of representation that also goes back to the 1640s and was designed to show why the House of Commons, in particular, was the only legitimate representative of the people, of the nation, and not the king. And the argument that was made is the argument that becomes known as virtual representation. That the reason Parliament is a good representative of the people is because it is a good representation of them. I mean, in the same way that we still talk about representational art, it's a kind of image of them. It mirrors them. If you look at the legislature, you should be able to get a sense of what the people it represents is like. It should look like them. It should be composed like them. And if you have a legislature like that, then its interests will be identical to the interests of the people as a whole. And so what it wants just is what the people want. And so the worry about tyranny just disappears because their interests are the same. They're connected. Because, as they all say, Parliament just is the people in this kind of metaphysical sense. It's reproducing them. Now, one of the implications of this is that voting becomes less important in the picture. Right? They still think the House of Commons should be elected, but they think that that's chiefly because elections will produce the right kind of image of the body of the people. A tiny minority of people in England actually have the franchise at this point. The franchise is attached to various corporate privileges, ownership in land, lots of other things. And there are tons of people, including very, very spectacularly rich people, who don't have the franchise. And so when the Americans say, well, look, we don't vote for anyone in parliament, their response is take a number. Most of us don't vote for anyone in parliament, but parliament represents us in the same way that it represents you. It's an image of the commonality, as they say, not just of the country, but of the empire. So the opposition in America is up against this view. And one way of explaining what happens next is like good lawyers, they have to figure out how to answer it. And so the requirement is sort of forensic. But I also think they genuinely become increasingly convinced that this can't be right. It's almost as if they're living in a reductio ad absurdum of this view. How could it be that this legislature over there, to which we have no connection and for whom we're not voting at all, who are separated from us by, this giant ocean, how could we be said to be represented by this body?
There seem to be two ways you could go with this. There are probably multiple ways you could go, but one way, we're separated by an ocean. There should be some of us in it. And then it would look a bit more like a representation of the whole. Maybe, it should be more like an imperial parliament in which there are small groups of people who are there to sort of picture the various colonies. But the problem with that is fairly obvious, which is those people are going to be outvoted, right? You could stick a few Americans in the House of Commons. I mean, this is a problem with legislatures and permanent minorities. The other way, which I think is sort of the way they go until they reach the dead end with that, is to, isn't it, suggest that the other way we might be represented is by the king. Even though we haven't voted for the king, but we haven't voted for the parliament either. So what?
That's exactly the conclusion that they reach. They basically are saying, look, and again, this is just to go back, it's part of, I think, this very comprehensive turn toward a whole set of arguments in political theory that had been made by 17th century royalists, or broadly defenders of monarchical power, which is to say that this whole picture of mirroring and reproducing and representing and all that is just nonsense. That has nothing to do. Let's come down to earth. You're my representative if I authorize you to act and speak in my name, like my lawyer or my accountant, right? Yes, that's what it is to be a representative. We don't care if my lawyer looks like me. We just care that he's been authorized by me to speak and act in my name within a particular domain. And as long as that's happened, what's going on is legitimate. And I am consenting to whatever he does. And therefore, I'm free in relation to the relevant domain. And they gravitate to this view. Now, of course, originally, the whole point of this view is to say you can authorize the king, just as you can authorize the House of Commons. And in fact, that's what undergirds the English Constitution. Not that we vote for king any more than we all voted at some point to be represented by the House of Commons, although we may vote for members of it. Rather, we sort of give our underlying consent to the overall constitutional architecture under which we live, and then every part of it, whether it's one person, several people, an assembly, all of them can be said to speak and act in our name. And this is what they begin to argue in relation to the monarch, right? So the claim is that at the beginning of colonial history, through our colonial charters, we authorized the king to act over us within particular constraints and within particular domains. We didn't give the king the right to tax us any more than he enjoys that authority in Great Britain itself. But we have authorized him to govern us according to the prerogative in relation to these external matters of foreign policy, trade, and all the rest. And we've certainly given him the negative voice, the veto, which, unlike the veto in Britain, I mean, there are technical issues here, which I won't bore you with, because what's called the veto or the negative voice in the colonial context is actually slightly different from the negative voice in Britain. But the royal disallowance, as it was called, had been used. The crown had disallowed any number of colonial bills throughout colonial history. Now, they knew that when the crown disallowed something, that wasn't the king doing it. It was the Privy Council, and in particular, this thing called the Board of Trade, which was controlled by the ministry, but it was acting in the name of the crown. But all of this, which they wanted to sort of reorient so it would just be the king, not the ministerial bureaucracy doing this. But all of that, the king had been authorized by the charters to do. And therefore, the king acted perfectly legitimately in relation to America because he'd been authorized to do so. What we had never done was authorize the House of Commons to govern us in any respect. And that's why Parliament has no jurisdiction over America. Now, there were any number of difficulties with this, not least the fact that quite a lot of the colonies didn't have charters. The different colonies had very different histories, and they also had very different juridical character and constitutional structure. So some of them were charter colonies. The famous one would be Massachusetts. Some of them started as charter colonies, Virginia, but then became royal colonies. Some were never chartered colonies, like New York, which was conquered territory and was a royal colony and never had a charter. And then there are places like Pennsylvania and Maryland, which are colonies that are personal grants in the first instance. Maryland to Lord Baltimore, Pennsylvania to William Penn, and then his descendants, and so on. So there are lots of different structures here. I mean, it's not one size fits all. And indeed, one of the really important points that isn't noted, I think, sufficiently often is that in several of the colonies, there was no power of royal disallowance. So Connecticut and Rhode Island, and actually Maryland, there was no royal disallowance. So what the Patriots, as they become known, were proposing to do was to extend the royal negative not just to Britain, where it hadn't been used as a matter of fact for generations, but also to colonies where it didn't exist, even on paper, right? So there are all kinds of issues here arising from the idiosyncrasies and path dependent political structures that grow up in the individual colonies. But that's the overall picture. That's their kind of the political story that they're now telling, that we had our charters, we granted and authorized the monarch to govern us in particular respects while reserving to our legislatures various other kinds of authorities, and that's it. That's where we are.
And that then creates the central puzzle where we started, which is the key to this story that you're telling. So, if in the middle of the 1770s, weirdly, these people seem to have been sort of guided or squeezed or by their own choice alighted upon a position which is, for want of a better word, royalist, and is actually extending royal authority in certain areas and so on. Very quickly, these people, as the situation becomes more and more intolerable for them, move to a position which is Republican and declare independence from the British Crown in a document that not exclusively but predominantly lists their grievances at the door of the king. He's named, right? It's him. So having, in a sense, got to a place where if we are going to stay in this empire, and what's happening is intolerable for us. We are being taxed. We're being asked to foot bills. We're not represented. That theory of representation is nonsense. It's a joke in a way. The only place for us is to get closer and closer to the king if we're going to stay in this. The move, which is we're going to leave it and we're done with it, is we also cannot tolerate the king's prerogative and power. How does that happen? How does that step, which is the revolutionary step in the end? I mean, it may be that the original position was itself revolutionary because it was taking on Parliament. Parliament was sovereign, and so it's not going to end well. But how does that step, which is the final step to independence, become independence from the king, not from Parliament?
It's why 76 is just such an extraordinary year in this context. And the first thing that happens is this extraordinarily, I mean, you see it when you're reading all this stuff, how traumatic it was for people. So by this point, the Continental Congress is meeting. It's petitioned the king directly to intervene on behalf of the colonies in relation to all of these sort of offending parliamentary statutes. And this is in the context of this extraordinary turn toward the king, juridically, politically. And what happens in sort of summer through the early fall of 75 is that the king says no.
Says no, not in the way they want him to say no, the wrong kind of no.
Yes, and it's very striking to look at his own letters. I mean, George III's letters to North and his ministers from this period, where he understands entirely what's going on and what the stakes are, and that the colonists are asking him to separate himself from Parliament and become king emperor. And he will not do this because at the end of the day, he's a Whig. And he says, look, I am going to be a parliamentary king or none, and I'm going to defend the rights of Parliament. And that notion, has a lot to say about his overall attitude in the years of the war itself when support begins to slip away in the Commons, because his view is, look, I'm fighting your war in defense of your jurisdiction and rights, not mine. But what he says publicly is just no. And he declares the colonists in a state of rebellion. At this point, blood has already been spilt the previous spring at Lexington, Concord, and so on. And it takes a while for word to reach the colonies of this event. And the text of the speech sort of arrives like a thunderbolt in January of 1776. And there is just this extraordinary sense of betrayal. And the other thunderbolt from the sky that hits in 1776 in this extraordinary coincidence is Tom Paine's Common Sense, which contains this ferocious attack on monarchy and grounded in a particular reading of the Hebrew Bible, which has its own history that I've been very interested in, that owes its lineage to rabbinic arguments, which essentially take the view that when the Israelites asked for a king, God got angry at them, not as people usually thought because they'd asked for the wrong kind of king, but because they'd asked for a king at all, because monarchy is an instance of the sin of idolatry. It's to replace God, your king, with a human king, and is therefore sort of illegitimate. And this argument sweeps the colonies. Common Sense is the great bestseller of the American 18th century. It's republished everywhere, but even that, the number of copies is sort of irrelevant, even though it's enormous, because it's also excerpted in all the papers and it's just spread everywhere. And everyone is commenting about the enormous influence and effect that it's having on people at this moment. And it's really a watershed. There's no question about it. And it makes the idea of an American monarchy after independence impossible.
And is it also echoing arguments from the 1650s as well, in the way that so much of this is rehearsing a much earlier revolution? Is Paine doing that?
Yes, and in fact, that's what his opponents are saying. They're saying, wait, I mean, you're just like reaching back into the 1640s, 50s grab bag here. You're making all of these arguments, but we've moved on, right? I mean, these kind of scriptural arguments, this is so retro. This is not the kind of thing we're interested in anymore.
And in a way, the point of the Glorious Revolution was that it allowed us not to have those deadly, bloody, all or nothing fights anymore. And you're taking us back again, not in a royalist way, but in a republican way, taking us back to sort of Milton or whoever, and the dark days of the Republic.
Yes, Milton was the key figure. And in fact, John Adams, in his autobiography, which is written years later, so you take it with a grain of salt. But of course, Adams, even at the moment, hated Common Sense and thought it was ridiculous and very dangerous. And he records that he spoke in 76 to Paine, and he basically said, look, I just think all of this stuff about the Old Testament and monarchy as idolatry is just stupid. And he says at this point, Paine laughed and said, well, I just took all of that from Milton. And then Adam says, and then went on to express something like a contempt for scripture, which shocked me. The second part probably is a bit of retrojection from the 19th century into the late 18th. But the first part is fair enough. Yes, that's one of the things they're saying. And they're also really worried about it because they think that it's distracting in a dangerous way. And this is maybe the point I'd make about it. That's to say, this Paine style Republican theory that stigmatizes kingship as idolatrous. What is it objecting to? It's objecting to the kingly title, to majesty, to deference, to pomp and ceremony, the pageantry of it all, the ways in which kings are reverenced like gods or something like that. And what these people are saying is, look, if you focus on that, you're focusing on the wrong thing. Who cares about the pageantry and the title? What we care about is what powers does a magistrate have? The English monarch has all the pageantry, but almost none of the power. So why should we worry about that? But conversely, if someone had none of the pageantry and all of the power, that would be the problem. And so, in a way, this is distracting in a potentially dangerous way. One of the critics writes, going back to the 17th century when William of Orange becomes William III, of William and Mary fame, he holds two offices. He's Statthalter, kind of chief magistrate of the United Provinces, and then King of Great Britain. But the point that this person is making is, look, he was way more powerful as Statthalter than he was as King of Great Britain, to the point that people jokingly called him the Stadtholder of Britain and the King of the United Provinces. And so it's just a kind of an instance of showing that really what matters is whether these people have prerogative powers and what they're able to do. And if you're a Whig, if you have a monarch who has basically no prerogative powers, effectively, and who really rules through a parliamentary ministry, you shouldn't have any worries about this. But conversely, if you had someone who isn't called king, but who does have prerogatives, that would be something really to worry about. And this is a kind of debate that's going on in this moment that's really going to echo in the following decade. So, yeah, no, I think it's really important. But you asked about the Declaration. And my view is it's a document that's very easy to misread in this way. And it's perfectly understandable why people do this. You sort of read the document and you see, well, gosh, they're really angry at the king. It's all addressed to the king, and the king has become a tyrant, and that's why we're declaring independence. But from the point of view of the people, I shouldn't say the people, because there are all kinds of figures with different views in the opposition movement, in the patriot movement, and they're working together and trying to converge in various ways. But they have, in many ways, very different fundamental ideas. But one of the things that was entirely noted at the time, it was perfectly intelligible in England, for instance, when the Declaration was published, was that actually by framing it in the way that they did, they were in fact endorsing rather than repudiating the constitutional position that they had developed in the previous 5 years or 6 years, right? According to which it was only the king who had jurisdiction over America. Because the point was, the word parliament, as you noted, doesn't appear. Because from their point of view, it didn't need to appear. Because we didn't need to declare independence from Parliament, because we were never dependent on Parliament. Parliament never had any jurisdiction, so there's no jurisdiction that we have to renounce. In order to become independent, all we have to do is withdraw our allegiance to the king, because it was only the king who had jurisdiction over America. And the language of the Declaration, which is complicated in the list of grievances, this kind of famous list of indictments, it's a sort of laundry list because it's including all of these specific grievances from each colony. It's quite a heterogeneous list. But one of the very important ones, for instance, which is quite general, is the one that says, and again, it's very difficult to a modern eye to get a grip on what's actually being said, because it's in this very roundabout language, but it says, the king, why is he a tyrant? Well, because he has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction alien to our constitution and foreign to our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, which is just French for he refused to veto these parliamentary bills. The jurisdiction that's alien to our Constitution is the jurisdiction claimed by Parliament, by the House of Commons. And he gave his assent, meaning he did not refuse his assent, which is what it would mean to negative a bill. So why was he a tyrant? Well, he was a tyrant because he refused to revive the veto for the first time, they thought, since the Glorious Revolution, to strike down these parliamentary bills and defend the liberties of his American subjects. So he's tyrannical insofar as he didn't use his prerogative powers to defend the colonies when he should have. And this is why we're breaking with him. But he's the only tie that we have. And so a number of the very shrewd responses to the Declaration in Britain, by the way, instantaneously, there are all of these texts that come out in London trying to explain this to English readers, because it's very difficult to decipher in various respects. And a lot of the grievances refer to these very particular events that nobody knows about, and they need like a crib, almost a kind of a critical edition. What is it that they're saying here? What are they complaining about? And one of the things that these texts are pointing out is that although the thing seems to be aimed at the king, it's aimed at Parliament. It's really aimed at us, the British people. The wound seems to be directed at the king, one of them says, but it's really intended for us. And they recognized this at the time.
The anger makes sense in the way that you've described it. So when you read it conventionally, it looks like a document of people whose anger at the king has been building up and building up and building up, and it explodes. But as you describe it, it's almost the opposite story, which is just as the king ended up, after 1776, saying to Parliament, I'm fighting your war. It's almost these are people saying to the king, we were fighting your war. This is the anger of betrayal, isn't it? In a way. And it's partly, it feels to me like people who, they're not all of them presumably particularly comfortable having been boxed into this royalist position, but that's where they found themselves. And then having found themselves there, they were hung out to dry. Because when you get past life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and the stuff that people remember, get into the meat of the document, my God, it's angry. I mean, it may be a bit weird and technical, but the charges against the king are wild. There's blood. There's no parliament in this document, but there's a lot of blood. It's dripping with that kind of, and it feels like, in human terms, a very recognizable form of anger, which is the anger of betrayal.
Yeah, I think you can't understand it unless you realize how much faith, trust, and constitutional expectation they had placed in and on the king before this moment to understand the ferocity of their sense of rejection. And as you say, betrayal and repudiation, that seems to me central to the moment that we're talking about. You can't understand it without that.
And of course, as you were saying, and I'm sure people listening will have picked up on this, as these arguments start to develop about what kind of executive power we might get if it's not called a king. And the question is maybe not so much what it is called, but what actual power it wields. That clearly is going to be a question for this new republic, which has to decide what kind of executive it wants, what kind of veto power it wants to bestow on that executive, what it wants to call that executive, and if it's not going to be a king, what kind of power that executive will have. And these are going to be, as we will talk about next time, the central arguments about the presidency. And they are arguments that are ongoing in 2025. Today's episode was the first of 3 about America and the American Revolution. Next time, in our regular slot, I'm talking to Eric about the Constitution, how to read that, and how to make sense of the weird mix of ideas that it contains. And then there's going to be a bonus episode in which I will try and make sense of what some of the things we have been discussing in these 2 episodes have to do with what's going on in America today. Why are some people in 2025 still saying that what America needs is a king? This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.